Sorry about that. So basically we have 4 different wines that we focus on this month, and we have 2 whites and 2 reds. I'm going to walk you through all of the wines tonight. We'll talk about them together. No stress if you're not opening all of them. Everybody likes to interact with these events a little bit differently. What I like to do for them is I have a core event. So I'm able to open up all of the wines and pour like small amounts without like wasting the wine. Hi, great to see you. And you can choose to open 1 wine, 2 wines, 3 wines, 4 wines. It's really up to you and how you like to do it. You can feel free to have family around, just you, it's all good. So without further ado, let's get into the first wine that we picked for our new Wine Horizons box, which was the 2020 Domaine Julie Benau Picpoul de Pigny. For our first wine that we selected, I wanted to pick something that you might have had before or might not have. I don't know if anybody here has had Picpoul before. You can feel free, once again, to raise your hand. I see Laura did that. Amazing. But I wanted to pick a wine region that is kind of well known for, I'd say, having a wine that's large, like overall large production, and not always known for quality, but I wanted to kind of change that misconception. So the style of wine is called Picpoul de Pigny. So Picpoul is the grape varietal. Pigny is actually one of the villages that produces the wine. It comes from the Languedoc region. So we're going to southwestern France in the Languedoc, and the Languedoc-Roussillon will actually focus on for our first 2 wines, which is kind of exciting because I think that this is an area of France that is not as well known for quality in comparison to Bordeaux or Burgundy or Champagne or some of the most kind of famous wine regions. But there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on in the Languedoc-Roussillon. And the reason is because there's not as much like strict standards in terms of what grapes that you can plant. And also too, since it's a southern region, for a very long period of time, there was a lot of like bulk wine production that happened in the area. So you didn't find a lot of like high quality wines for a long period of time. And then producers started coming in, experimenting with different grapes, and you started to see the level of quality really go up over the years. So while the Languedoc is known primarily actually for red wine production because it's in the south of France, and usually as you get further south, you'll find more and more red grapes will thrive, whereas up in the north, it'll be more white grape specific. This is the really main area in the Languedoc for white wine production and the most famous white wine of the Languedoc region, and one of the most famous wines, I'd say, of southern France. Picpoul is actually a grape that translates, it's fun to say too, Picpoul, to lip stinger. So lip stinger, it's called that because it literally is a grape that is known for having that really bright, refreshing acidity. But it's also a grape varietal that is known for being able to be planted in kind of higher yields so that you can actually find tons of it that can grow. Producers don't really have much trouble planting a ton of it and producing a ton of it. And actually the majority of Picpoul that you see actually comes from co-ops. So that means a bunch of farmers coming together, usually producing wine that doesn't come from one specific vineyard. It can come from a larger swath. And as I mentioned too, while Picpoul de Pigny can come from the Pigny village, it can actually come from 6 communes. So if you're cool, I'm going to share my screen with you guys for a moment because it would be very exciting for you guys to see a map. So hold on one sec. And let me know if you can see this in one sec. Can everybody see the map? Yes, awesome. And feel free to, everybody can have their camera on or off. It's up to you and how you want to do it. But you can see here, we're in southwestern France. You can see some of these communes here. There's these 6 different communes, all in the different shades of green. And what's interesting here is we're in the southwest of France, but you can see the Mediterranean Sea right here. And what's really interesting is there's this little like basin, the Basin de Taux, which is right in front of like the majority of these Picpoul vineyards. So it's actually is very close to the ocean. You have like these moderating breezes from the Mediterranean. And this basin here is actually well known too for a lot of like oyster farming that happens right there. So you can see all these like wonderful little flats for oyster farming that take place here, and the kind of 6 different distinctive villages that are most well known for peat pool production. I'm going to stop my share right now. We're back. So an interesting kind of map just to kind of see a little bit further like where you're at. Because you'll find that peat pool is in such close proximity to a lot of shellfish farming. It is a classic pairing with shellfish. And actually, as I mentioned, the majority of peat pool that's out there is once again pretty inexpensive. You can find it in the kind of $10 to $15 price point. And it tends to be pretty simple, crisp, refreshing, but nothing like special. Usually it would be a wine too meant to kind of drink right away, enjoy, especially in the summertime. But what I wanted to do is kind of find a peat pool that's a little bit more elevated, as we say. So we're here with a producer that's kind of on the up and up, a little female, amazing rock star producer of the south of France named Julie Benau. And Julie Benau is interesting, actually. A lot of the best peat pool producers that I've found in the Languedoc actually are female winemakers. I don't know, they just might have a special touch on the wines. But Julie Benau is interesting because her family actually came upon in about 1980 a 16th century farmhouse that they took over that had vines growing, and they took it over. They were replanting some of the vines, but mainly just selling the fruit to the local co-ops, just like the majority of most peat pool producers. But Julie decided when she came back from winemaking school, she also had an interest in kind of taking over the family business, that the quality of their grapes was so high and that they had some older vines that she actually wanted to start bottling some of their own wine under their own label. So she started that in 1999 and has kind of been a pioneer of some really high quality peat pool that's really interesting and fun. You can see the front of the label too. All of her labels are kind of wacky. This one's kind of the most classic, but is an old sketch that she found of an oyster from one of her school textbooks, which is really interesting, which goes over some of the different parts of the oyster. And what we find here too is just a peat pool that's a little bit more elevated. So we still have that like lip singing acidity that's really crisp and refreshing. In terms of fruit, you tend to get more of that kind of citrus and a little bit of that underripe tropical fruit. So when I'm tasting this, it just has a lot more aromatics on the nose than the average peat pool, which can tend to be like a little bit more neutral. On the palate, you still get that kind of like underripe citrus and a little bit of that like almost like tropical fruit like pineapple, but still that really refreshing acidity. And it is honestly really amazing for me, you know, getting to see a warmer climate grape such as peat pool, an area which has so much sunshine, but you have these moderating breezes which still create like a wine that's incredibly fresh and really clean and uplifting. And has a little bit of texture too. You're starting to find a lot of producers will always age peat pool in stainless steel, but you're starting to find producers such as Julie Benau that are adding what's called like lees contact or lees stirring, which takes like kind of the dead yeast cells of the wine and stirs it around. It just gives the wine a little bit of added texture, and it just adds like a little bit more elegance, a little bit more kind of refinement here, which is really cool. Interestingly enough, there are only about 24 different producers of peat pool. So while it's kind of well known in a lot of, especially in England and like a lot of kind of like entry level wines, it actually doesn't have a ton of different winemakers out there. And also something that's interesting about peat pool is I'd say if you're looking for something that it's similar to, if you've ever had like Vinho Verde before from like northern Portugal, or if you've had Muscadet, a style of wine from the Loire Valley. These are two kind of styles of wine which I say are somewhat comparable, just in terms of the fact that it's a lighter bodied white wine, not too fruity, and has like refreshing crisp acidity. So I'd love to hear like any questions that you might have about this wine, or just like thoughts if you got to try it. You can feel free to be as interactive as you like.
I've never had this varietal before. I'm sitting here making dinner and sipping on it, and I really like it. I like the minerality and just the brightness and the high acidity. It was really nice.
Oh, I'm so glad. It's so fun because once again, this is, if anybody had some peat pools before, like literally there's a lot of crappy peat pool out there, just in the sense that it can be sometimes very simple, not interesting. But this is like really beautiful because it has that bright, refreshing, uplifting acidity, but it has some really beautiful textural elements to it too. I was doing a little reading actually on Peak Pool, and something interesting that I just found out is there, as of 2018, the appellation is coming out with a new style of Peak Pool, which is called Patience de Peak Pool, which is a style of Peak Pool that they're trying to make, which actually has some long-term aging capability, which is kind of interesting. The reason I bring that up is I don't know if anybody was here when I was talking about, we featured a Muscadet wine from the Loire Valley in one of our past CruBoxes. And that's a style of wine that's also known to be paired with oysters in the Loire Valley. It's like light and fresh and simple. And it was a wine that everybody would always just think you just kind of drink it right away, had no aging potential. But they're actually finding that some of those wines do have age-worthy potential if they're treated the right way. So I guess they're doing some experimentation with that with the Peak Pool varietal as well, which is kind of interesting. So I have not tasted any of these wines, but I will let you know once I do and let you know if they're worth it. And that's kind of part of the fun of wine, right? Is they're always doing research. There's always like interesting things to learn about varietals that sometimes we can just write off. So I thought that was quite interesting and exciting. Anybody else get to try it and have any thoughts or feedback?
I really like Pool, and the someone suggested it once, and they said that it was like a table wine at like a Michelin star restaurant. So I feel like it's like pretty easy drinking for it's like good for a crowd. But yeah, it's like I get it a lot when we like are like hosting or anything, because I think it is a crowd pleaser.
I agree. I mean, it's crisp, refreshing, it's easy. It's a lot of fun. And I always love to, so you always find them in these like classic green tall bottles. And you have this like little embossed like label here, which is always like typical to find. You'll find that kind of throughout like the Languedoc, but typical to Peak Pool as well. But it's so much fun. And Julie Banau is like, she's really crazy. She's definitely in the natural movement for winemaking. And she actually makes to something that we've carried before. We don't have it in stock right now, but if anybody's interested, I'm happy to follow up. She does a Peak Pool with actually skin contact, like more like an orange wine, which is like very experimental and kind of wacky and wild, with like very limited sulfur added. And so she's kind of like really experimenting and pushing the boundaries. And she also makes some Syrah and a couple other red varietals as well, but she's definitely very interesting and fun, and at the same time making a wine that's very elegant too.
How long has she been doing that for?
She's been making wine, like she's technically been working with her family since I'd say probably like the mid 90s, but they started bottling and selling their wine since 1999. So she's been doing it for a little while now, which is pretty awesome. Any questions before I move on to the next wine?
That's delicious. Thank you.
Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it. So definitely in terms of pairing, once again, I had put a little recipe for like a kind of smokier fish stew, which I thought would be fun for the winter time. This is definitely a wine that like begs for seafood, especially oysters, shellfish, crustaceans. I think that's always like a great pairing, but you can also too take a wine like this that has high acidity and pair it with like a richer, softer cheese, and it will like cut right through. It can be good with like saltier charcuterie. A lot of these like kind of high acid whites can neutralize like salt or like iodine. So anything that like is like very salty can be like a really nice pairing with something like this, people. So everybody enjoy. Our second wine, if you're ready to get into it, is the kind of wildest wine that I think I chose out of these four. So pretty fun. I have actually my Corbin on it, so you can take a look at it. But this is the 2020 Domaine d'Anjou Benicy Supernova. So well as the Peak Pool de Pinet was under like that category, Peak Pool de Pinet, this is technically what's called like a Vin de France, which we'll talk about in a second, though it's coming from the Roussillon region in southwestern France. So I'm going to take a second, excuse me, and share my screen once again really quickly, just so you can see another map. All right, everybody see that? We're going to the next place. Okay, So we were in the Languedoc. So you could see that the Languedoc is actually that like kind of northern part that's like in purple. You can see the little bay right there where you have like the peak pool production up north. But as you go down, you have the Roussillon. And the Roussillon, I'd say, is one of like also a very interesting area where there's so much experimentation going on and a lot of really interesting winemakers gravitating to the area. It's also too basically right on the border of Spain, as you can see at the bottom. So kind of a really interesting geography. And we have this producer, Jean-Jus Benassi, which is basically right in like what's called like the Côte Catalan, which you can see all the way at the bottom. So I wanted to kind of give you that little share there before I kind of go into the history of this producer, as they actually have heritage from Spain and not from France, though they moved to France. But it makes sense if you see that Spain is literally right next door. So I'm going to stop my share here for a second. So Jean-Jus Benassi is a little 17-acre estate. It was actually founded by like the Benassi family, but it was taken over, I think, about at least 20 plus years ago by the brothers Benoit and Sebastian. And actually their grandfather before was making wine. He's making a style of wine which is well known from the area, which is called Rive Salt or Muscat de Rive Salt, which is more like a fortified wine coming from like the Muscat varietal, because they're known actually for making a lot of different fortified and like dessert style wines in that part of the world. So that was kind of principally what they were known for before. These brothers actually like wanted to experiment with some of the classic varietals that they had in the area, but they wanted to kind of put their own spin on things. So some of the grapes that they're working with in the Roussillon are grapes such as Grenache. Grenache you probably know from especially being in the Rhone Valley, but what's interesting is Grenache Noir is what we see the most, the red varietal, most well known for being in styles of wine such as Chateauneuf de Pape. Or usually the majority of the blend in a Côte de Rhône blend. But there's actually also too a lot of like mutations of the Grenache grapes. So there's a Grenache Gris, there's a Grenache Blanc. They work with all of them. And then they're also working with grape varietals that you find in the southern part of France, such as Carignan. And then Carignan also has a Carignan Gris as well. But most interestingly, they wanted to experiment with the grape Muscat or Muscat of Alexandria. So this is a kind of a tricky grape to talk about, I think, because it has a like pretty intense misconception. So there are actually a lot of different types of like Muscat, and Muscat is also known as like Moscato. So like tends to be known as like more of a dessert wine. The Muscat that we know most in France is actually most well known for being planted in like the Alsace region of northern France, where you can find it in some of their Grand Cru wines. You can find it in dessert wines. And then it's also planted in Italy, where it's known as Moscato, most well known for being in Moscato d'Asti, which tends to be a lightly sparkling wine from Piedmont in northern Italy. But we're talking about a different iteration of Muscat because there actually are several. We're talking about one called Muscat of Alexandria. So you find that most widely planted in France, in the southern part of France, in the Roussillon. And you also find it kind of throughout Spain, where it can be planted kind of closer down to where a lot of like sherry production happens, like closer to Malaga. And you also find it in one of my favorite areas in Sicily, where it's actually well known as Zabibo, if anybody's ever tried that before. If not, I can make a recommendation, of course. But Zabibo is actually most well known for, or Muscat of Alexandria, being closer to where you find the western part of like Sicily. There's a little island called Pantelleria, which is like southwest of Sicily. And it's actually known for making like Zabibo or Muscat of Alexandria in like a dried style dessert wine, which is very interesting. And then they plant it kind of all throughout the island. You found that like Muscat de Alexandria can be made in sweet iterations and it can be drier, but it's always known for having high-powered aromatics that tend to be more in that like kind of orange fruit family. Think like oranges, tangerines, lots of those kind of like richer orange citrus fruits. And it also can be known for having like aromatics of like rose petals and like kind of floral elements as well. But it's definitely a grape that's interesting. And I think kind of underappreciated, undervalued, because a lot of people think about it and associate it with dessert wines. This is not only Muscat of Alexandria coming from southern France, but it's made in a very different style than any of the wines that we're drinking tonight. This is like what would be called an orange wine, meaning that they're using the skins of the white grapes in a way that they would macerate like a red wine. So they're taking the grape skins, letting them macerate for several weeks to up to, I think, a month for this wine, which is going to give it this more deep color. You can also see too, since these are the brothers of d'Anjou-Benicy are very like natural and biodynamic focused, you can see that this wine is like unfined and unfiltered too. If you like hold it up to the light, you can kind of see it as I'm holding it up to the light here, which is another kind of stamp of a lot of these like really naturally focused producers. When you put your nose on this, like, I don't know if there are any beer drinkers here, but this really reminds me of like kind of more of that like Belgian like white ale in style. I see you nodding over here, because honestly, like that is exactly what kind of comes to mind, that like orange peel, like coriander, those like baking spices on the nose. It's not what you'd expect from a wine when you kind of stick your nose in here. And on the palate, it's honestly like very surprising. This is a wine, when you nose it, it smells like it's going to be really kind of a little funky, but on the palate, it's actually a lot cleaner and drier than one might expect, which is pretty cool. And it has this just like really beautiful complex acidity, which I must say like really surprised me when I first had wines. When I was overall like tasting some of the wines from d'Anjou-Benicy, I always am just incredibly surprised how some of these like really warm climate areas that have a ton of sunshine can create wines that have a lot of freshness and they don't taste as ripe as they should. So I was really surprised. And Muscat is one of those grapes too that I don't always think of as having really good acidity. It usually tends to sometimes be like a little more flat. So this like really kind of surprised me and excited me. It's clean, it's fresh. Honestly, the wines from this producer, if anybody's looking to get like really geeky, are incredibly interesting. Like they, once again, do a couple really interesting whites that are Grenache Blanc and Grenache Gris focused. They do some beautiful Carignan based wines, some Grenache Noir. Their obsession, the Benoit and Sebastian's obsession, is this producer out of Châteauneuf-du-Pape named Chateau Rayos, which is known for making a style of Châteauneuf-du-Pape, typically a Grenache Noir focused blend that's incredibly fresh. Even though once again, that's an area that has a lot of sunshine and can make really rich, kind of more extracted wines. So overall, just with the wines from this producer, I've just been incredibly kind of excited and uplifted by the fact that they're super focused, really fresh, really clean, though at the same time embracing some more kind of natural techniques here. And they actually, there's a style of winemaking called biodynamic, which is taking organic farming a step further. It uses a bunch of different principles of biodynamic farming that you can follow. And these brothers have actually found that they like can't really work with biodynamics because they feel like their climate's too warm and a lot of the practices don't really suit their climate. So they've kind of like started a lot of their own farming techniques that like are kind of beyond biodynamics is what they call it. So they're just really kind of experimental and doing a lot of kind of wacky yet really interesting things. But I think at the end of the day, what I find really interesting is just the dedication is really quite amazing. Not only, once again, is this wine have a month of skin contact in it, but it's actually aged in neutral barrels as well. So once again, with the neutral barrel aging, it's just meaning to give that wine a little enhanced texture, to kind of soften it up a little bit, but it's not meaning to get any kind of oak flavor or characteristic in the wine. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on the Supernova. This is definitely one of those wines that like makes you think it's not what you expect, and it could be quite polarizing, but I'd love to hear if anybody got to try it, what they thought.
Well, I think it's a great mashup of your, as you put it, with the beer and the wine.
Yeah.
I'm here with Tom. I don't know if you can see me.
Yes.
Can now.
But my first impression was, oh my God, this is so gross. but it isn't.
So interesting. It's sometimes I think the funny thing with wine, I find this all the time because like I think there's a lot of times with wine where like, you know, we're so used to sometimes the things that we're used to drinking. And when I nose this wine initially, I was like, oh my gosh, this is like and then you taste it and then you're like, oh, okay, well this is interesting. And then you go back to it. And it's so interesting when you take that second sip, that third sip, like how it changes and how it feels more normal. I don't know if that makes sense.
Or I got hoodwinked. No, it's really, I'm thrilled that I tried something like this. I wouldn't,
Yeah.
or I would never have this
Never would.
opportunity.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Oh, I'm so glad. It's honestly so fun. And honestly too, these are the types of wines too, sometimes that like really beg for food. Like sometimes on their own, some of these wines can feel like a little off-putting, especially when you are playing around with a lot of French and Italian wine. I find that sometimes, you know, having it with a piece of food is going to really change the experience.
Mhm.
I was kind of struggling with like what to pair with this wine because it's like, you know, a little different off the beaten path. So I put it with a halibut recipe, which I thought would be kind of quite fun, roasted veggies. But I also think once again, with just like a soft, like kind of like even like pretty aromatic cheese, this could really come alive. And I think it would be really fun to experiment with. I was also kind of thinking too, some like, you know, Middle Eastern like spice dishes or Turkish spice dishes could be kind of interesting with some of these like more exotic aromatics here. But it's just a fun wine to play around with. And I think it's one of those things too. I would never like, you know, go and grab a dry Muscat wine off the shelf. You know, it's just not something that you think of, but like, I love these producers that are taking some of these like concepts, working with some of these grapes that are indigenous to their area and like really putting out some interesting thought-provoking wines. And we're all just learning every day. So that's part of it.
It is fun.
It
is fun.
is.
It's so floral. I mean,
Yeah, it is. And it's like, but it's also just has like a lot of that kind of like orange zest and freshness too, which like, it just, I feel like I'm getting my dose of vitamin C. I don't know if that's like,
Whatever it takes.
but if once again, I'm always happy to make some recommendations if you were interested in this producer. There's a lot of really other fun wines to explore. And this is on the, I'd say, lower end of price point for this producer, Knowledge Benessy. This is in about the 30-ish range, but their wines, a lot of them retail in that like $50 to $75 price point, which I at first thought was really high for, you know, the area. Like usually the Languedoc-Roussillon is not known for more expensive wines. It's sometimes even harder to find wines over like $20-ish from the area, but they're actually quite sophisticated and so interesting and thought-provoking. And it's just kind of like really fun to get to explore. I'm glad you got to explore it with me. That's fun.
Thanks.
Any questions or thoughts you might want to share before I go into our next wine? All right, let's do it. Cool. I'm going to share my screen with you guys again really quickly. Okay. All right. Okay, so I wanted to share this with you kind of before I go into the wine because we have maybe shared a couple wines from the Savoie before with CruBox, but it's one of those areas that I'm always like really fascinated with, both in the eastern part of France, as you can see that little red area in the east, kind of close to Switzerland. This is an area that's known for these really interesting like alpine like style whites and reds. And as we're kind of in the heart of wintertime, it's always really fun to explore some of these wines. And there's always more to find out here. There's always wines that I like haven't gotten to taste before from the Savoie, and I'm always like really intrigued by this area. So I wanted to share a relatively new producer to the market with you. But I'll tell you before we get into this, you can see all the little areas here within the Savoie all like color coded. The wine that we're tasting today is technically in this like green area which is called Vin de Bougie. There's a style of wine that you might have had before from the Savoie, which is called bougie or typically bougie Cerdon. It actually, a lot of the styles that you find in the Massachusetts market tend to be sparkling, though they can make still wines as well. And they're grapes that are planted in this area, such as Altesse or Jacquer, or you'll find Pinot Noir, Mondeuse, Gamay, all these like fun grapes. So we'll chat about that in a second, but just wanted to show you a map so you can kind of get a sense of where you are. All right, we're back. Okay, so we have right here from Des Vins d'Envie, the Croix Yeti, or do you believe in Yetis? Wine, which is really fun. This is a little collaboration project between two wine growers out of the Savoie region. And it's a producer named Guillaume Lavie from Domaine de la Vins de la Vie and Maxime Donquan. And they're just two friends, one of which was a landscape architect who like got into wine, and they found this property in this like small little area called Ponchera, right in the, once again, PDO or area of Bougie. And they wanted to kind of create some interesting wines with some local varietals. So while they make wines from one of the most widely planted white grape varietals from the area called Jacquer, which is like light and crisp and fresh, this is a fun blend that they do, which is also similarly to the Supernova that we had seen before. That was under a Vin de France category because it didn't quite fit within any of the like standards within Southwestern France. So sometimes they'll declassify the wine. The reason being, I'm sure, is because they're using skin contact with that orange wine. So sometimes you have to declassify from like the kind of larger general area. So just kind of interesting. You'll find that a lot. That doesn't mean anything about quality. It just sometimes means that some producers are not playing by the rules of their appellation. So they need to sometimes declassify their wines. So this is also under the Vin de France Rouge label, though it does come from the appellation of Bougie. And I guess they can't put Bougie on the label here because typically red wines coming from Bougie will be singular varietal wines, and this is a blend. So it doesn't fall within the like standards of the appellation, which is interesting, but it's still really refreshing and delicious nonetheless. This is a little blend here of 50% Gamay, 30% Mondeuse, and then 20% Pinot Noir. And so Gamay is going to be one of the principal grape varietals here, also known, of course, for being in the Beaujolais region of France. It gives the wines incredible kind of freshness, a lot of like red fruit, and also gives it like kind of like a beautiful lightness. Whereas the Pinot Noir also offers like more kind of alluring cherry fruits, a little bit more of that like refined acidity that comes through, and some really kind of soft tannins. And then the one grape that you might not have had in here before is the grape Mondeuse, which is an interesting varietal. It's actually a grape varietal that's known for having higher levels of acidity and a little bit more tannin. And it's honestly gives you this beautiful deep purple color and some more of that kind of red fruit floral characteristic, and a little bit more of those like gamier spices that come through. So it's an interesting blend. I love some of these kind of like field blends of like the Savoie. As we're getting into those colder months, these are the exact wines that I want to pair with like some of those kind of alpine cheeses such as Gruyere or like raclette, or some of those like really nice kind of nuttier cheeses. And I had actually had this as a pairing with I found this recipe. I'm obsessed with all the recipes for the New York Times cooking, which is like a butternut squash like in custard, because I think that this goes incredibly well with a lot of those kind of Thanksgiving, what I call Thanksgiving flavor, which are like butternut squash, the rich kind of warm spices, a little bit of that like cheesy creaminess can go really nicely with these kind of lighter, more aromatic wines. This is a wine that's just meant to be playful and fresh. It's not, once again, anything that needs age or, you know, a lot of decanting. It's just kind of a fun representation of like what the Savoie has to offer. And once again, it gives you a little introduction to a lesser known varietal, Mondeuse, which is kind of fun to explore. This is a wine that I would actually put like a little chill on it. It's totally your call in terms of how you feel, but I think it can be like a little nice just to have it tiny bit chill, as it kind of brings out a little bit more of those like fruit aromas. But this is also too one of those like classic wines to do with like your cheese and charcuterie pairing as well. Or of course, any fondue or raclette type of situation that you have going on. This is aged to for about 6 months. So there's, I think, it's maybe a combination of stainless steel and then old barrels. So there's really not much oak to see or taste here, but it's delicious, a little bit earthy, and really kind of starts off the Alpine season strong, in my opinion. Any thoughts or questions on the CruBox?
That's what Skylar and I are drinking. And it's really delicious. And it's interesting because I can really taste the raspberry juice. I wasn't quite expecting that, but
Yeah, they're like, honestly, typically with the Gamay and Pinot Noir, they're always grapes that tend to give you like more of that red fruit. In terms of that like cherry raspberry, that's definitely very classic. So, but it's more kind of that like spiced, raspberry, like a little bit of that like kind of brambly.
yeah, it does have some spice actually.
And a lot of earthy tones.
Yeah, it's always interesting. What I find about a lot of these wines from the Savoie or the Jura in Eastern France is it's that combination of that like light, bright, like a lot of red focused fruits, and then like earthy undertones and kind of more savory undertones, which can make it once again really great with also like some lighter like meat-based dishes or more kind of like a larger display of charcuterie. It's always like that beautiful interplay though of like the red fruit and the savory quality, which I think is just a lot of fun. This producer too has once again a couple other really interesting wines that I've seen. If you want to explore some more wines from the Savoie, especially Jacquer or this grape Altesse, there's a lot of like interesting white varietals to explore if you like clean, bright, like mineral driven whites. And they do, I think, 100% Mondeuse as well, if you want to experience the grape varietal in its entirety. I have some crew members who I work with all the time who are always looking for really kind of obscure varietals, singular varietals to taste on their own. So it's kind of like a fun one to get to explore. For sure.
It's true that with the charcuterie, this will Bigfoot the food.
I know the label's just like so much fun, and as like a lover of skiing and alpine culture, it's definitely got me feeling very, very festive for the winter. So awesome. Any thoughts or questions that you want to share on the Yeti?
We love raclette in this house, Chelsea, so we are very excited. Yeah, we have a little raclette machine, and
Amazing.
yeah, what do you call it? Machine. So we're excited to pair this with that.
Oh, it'll be so much fun. It's like super, super yummy. Honestly, I always love to do, especially like those Pinot Noir Gamay, like based wines, like with like those Alpine cheeses, I think is like always such a good combination. Or even to like a more aged cheddar can work really nicely too. But they tend to go really nicely with like more nutty, like harder cheeses. So that's always like a winning combination in my opinion. Cool. Awesome. Well, we'll go into the next wine unless anybody has any questions or thoughts or feelings that they'd like to share. Cool. All right. Last wine, we have the 2018 Amplea Carignano, sorry, which is coming from Tuscany in Italy. So another wine too, this is actually it's under what's called like an IGT or Indicazione Geografica Tipica called Costa Toscana Rosso. So with the, once again, Italian classification, this is the kind of second level up. You have like what's called your Vino di Tavola or VDT wines, which have like, you can kind of put anything you want on the front of the label. There's no restrictions. Then you have your next step up, which is called the IGT or Indicazione Geografica Tipica, which will typically tell you which region within the 20 regions of Italy this is coming from, and sometimes even a sub-region too. So once again, this is taking Tuscany, which is in the central western part of Italy, and it's going to a specific area, which is the coast of Tuscany, an area called the Maremma. So I'll share my screen once more so you can see kind of exactly where this is. There isn't a great map for this, so we're gonna give you two different maps here that we'll kind of walk through together, and excuse the fact that they're not wonderful. They look a little bit like a 6-year-old did them. So we have like the region of Tuscany to the left here, and you can see that like most of the Maremma is going to be this like kind of white region all the way like to the south. So you have like a lot of kind of room there, and then you have here a lot of like different subregions in the Maremma. But you can see that like on the image to the right, where we're going is what's called the Metalliferous Hills, which is kind of in the northwestern part of this like little like white detailed area. So just like to the northwest of like that town called Grosseto is going to be where like the majority of this wine is produced. Interestingly enough, Ampalea is like one of the most fascinating kind of natural wineries of Italy, because it comes from a wonderful winemaker who's one of my favorite winemakers of Northern Italy. Her name is Elisabetta Foradori, and she focuses on wines coming from like the Alto Adige in Italy. And she focuses on a lot of different indigenous grape varietals from the Alto Adige that are really interesting. Among them, a grape varietal called Tiraldigo, which is a red grape varietal. And so she's a huge fan of kind of like supporting all of those local grapes. But interestingly enough, the Ampalea wine project that she has in Tuscany is actually focused on a lot of non-indigenous grape varietals. So if you've heard me talk about this before, I'm always really fascinated by the like discussion that happens within Italy between producers using indigenous and non-indigenous varietals. There's a lot of Italian producers who get very up in arms for any producer that's using grapes that are not indigenous to Italy. But at the same time, a lot of these grapes, especially a lot of grapes from France, came over to Italy at some point, and now they're kind of using bits and pieces of them all throughout Italy. So this is an interesting project because once again, it is championing a lot of like non-indigenous grape varietals, but grapes that have been in this area for a long period of time were brought over by shipping and have seen some success in the Tuscan subregion of the Maremma. So Ampalea is actually an estate that basically Elisabetta Foradori and two of her good friends started. And what's interesting about it is there's about 120 hectares that they own, but they only have about 35 hectares planted to vine. So they have a ton of space for nature to roam. It's actually like, interestingly enough, in this park, like it's like a national park, which is called the Metallifore Geopark in the Upper Maremma. And it's a park you can actually visit because it shows a lot of like historical mining sites that have been there for hundreds of thousands of years. And you can kind of take a walk through the park. There's like all these different caves that you can go into, but then there's a ton of nature to just be able to take in. So you basically have all of these different vineyards. They own about like 5 or 6 different vineyard sites or parcels within this park. And amongst them is just all nature. So it's an interesting project. She's focusing on a lot of like mono varietals, and the grapes that she's focusing on most are Carignano, which we'll talk about in a second, which is also known as Carignan in southern France. And then she also does a ton of work with what's called like Alicante Nero, which is also known as Grenache in southern France, or Grenache Noir. So Alicante Nero is basically like a biotype that was like brought over to Italy, and now it's kind of taken over its own kind of distinctive characteristics, though it is technically Grenache Noir, but they call it Alicante Nero. And she also works with indigenous white grape varietals such as Malvasia. And she does work with a little Sangiovese and some kind of traditional varietals too. But definitely the Alicante is a grape that she's very, very passionate about, and Carignano. And Carignan or Carignano is a grape that I'm actually somewhat passionate about because it's a grape that you just don't really see a lot of times on its own. You can find it in a lot of blends, but it's very rare to find it on its own. So in southern France, you'll find it in some of the like blends of the Rhone Valley. You'll find it sometimes in the Languedoc and Roussillon. As I mentioned, actually, our producer from Supernova, the d'Anjou Venecy, make their own Carignan, which is pretty cool. And you actually also find it a lot in Spain, where it's in, if anybody's ever had the wines south of Barcelona and Priorat or Montsant, Carignan makes up usually a large variety of those blends. And it also is known as Mazuelo in Rioja, where it's like used as a blending varietal too. So you can kind of find it all about. But what I always find really interesting about the grape is it always has like a strong like kind of undertone of like licorice, or sometimes like even like a little bit of that like kind of like root beer, like sarsaparilla type characteristic to it, which I always find really intriguing and distinctive. And interestingly enough, I found out about the grape is that Carignan was actually the most widely planted grape varietal of France up until about the 1970s. It's a super high yielding grape, so you can plant a ton of it, but they found it to be a little too harsh when it was like overplanted. And so Merlot started to replace a lot of the Carignan plantings because it could also be planted just about anywhere, and it could also be high yielding, but it was more kind of fruit forward and a little bit more crowd pleasing. So you found that like Carignan kind of went down to little to nothing. And it's pretty rare to find in Italy as well. Definitely super rare to find in Tuscany, not at all normal. Just Ampalea is kind of championing this grape. If you were to look for Carignan or Carignano in Italy, you would actually go to Sardinia, the island just to the west of Tuscany. And they actually make Carignano 100% there. And they actually also produce Grenache there as well, because it's a warm climate area, and that's kind of what Carignan loves. It loves the sunshine. This, like the wines of Ampalea, I've always found to be quite amazing and interesting. They have an entry-level wine called Un Litro, which is like a super fun blend, literally in a liter form. That you can try. They make an orange wine from the grape Malvasia blended with Trebbiano and a couple other indigenous Italian varietals. But their single varietal red wines, such as the Carignano, I think are just some of the most interesting things that they do. And they really showcase grapes that are grown amongst nature. So this vineyard that plants the Carignano is called Campo al Finicchio, which translates basically to field of fennel, because there's a bunch of fennel plants that grow all around the vineyard. So you can sometimes find just like when you plant all of these other crops around the vineyard site, sometimes you can get some subtle characteristics. They also grow strawberries around the vineyard as well. This is delicious. So what I love about this is you definitely find a little bit more tannin, but still that like incredible freshness that comes through. Definitely that baking spice kind of licorice, raspberry, and definitely a little bit of that like little fig as well, which is just incredibly fresh and pleasant. This is an interesting wine. I actually had it paired with a pork dish. I think you could totally do this with like turkey or any type of like bird too as well. But I thought pork could be nice as this has like a little bit of a backbone, but it's nothing too intense. And I actually also found too that like anything with like cranberry or more of like a red fruit focus like sauce, I thought would be like a really nice counterplay with the aromatics in this wine.
So we're having this with a pork roast with cranberry stuffing
Ooh,
tonight. Cranberry apple fennel.
perfect. Loving your life right now.
Yeah, well,
Have you gotten to taste them together?
Sorry?
Have you gotten to try them together yet?
No, we just came out of the oven, so
Oh, you'll have to let me know.
Okay.
Awesome.
Not gonna lie, I've been looking behind you, and you look like you have a very fun kitchen.
I enjoy cooking a lot.
It's nice,
Well,
very nice.
Well,
Jealous.
we're enjoying the wine.
Yeah, it's a nice wine.
Yeah, it's honestly,
It-
their wines are so much fun and they're so interesting. And it just, once again, I'm always like pretty, I'm not always very supportive of non-Indigenous Italian varietals in Italy, but this is something that I can get behind and support. I think it's
You're sitting and eating here.
I just get it from
any other like thoughts or questions about the Carignano?
I really enjoy it. I like this one quite a lot. It's yeah, it's
You're doing good.
I think it's good on its own. I think it'll be really nice with the food.
yeah, I agree.
It's distinctive. It's very fruity, so that makes it easy to drink, solo.
Yep. Had you anybody here had Carignan on its own before?
I must have by now.
Yeah. It's just once again one of those grapes I just very rarely find like at 100% on its own. So it's just kind of fun. I once again always like love being able to understand distinctly like what makes a grape unique. And there's a lot of grapes that sometimes you only find blended. So it's just really great when you get the opportunity to kind of taste something on its own and understand the personality of the grape a little bit more.
Yeah, it's really quite interesting.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
It's
But
more complex than the last red wine that we had.
Sorry, it was a little more what?
Complex.
Yeah, for sure. I'd say like the Yeti is definitely meant to be just like fun, fresh, kind of like, playful, like the Yeti itself, maybe. The Carignano is definitely a wine that's like more serious, it's more structured, and it definitely can drink well now, but it can go for several years. She hasn't done a ton of experimentation, Elisabetta, with like some of the aging of some of these wines, but I'd say I'd put it in for 5 years, but I'm sure it could go for a little bit longer. But it's just, once again, a really interesting wine. It's fun sometimes to find something that can taste well on its own, but also is just wonderful with food. And sometimes that can be a little rare with some of the Italian varietals, as they can sometimes be a little harsh just on their own. But you guys did it. We went through 4 wines together. It's amazing. It was really fun to be with everybody. And I'll just say too, a couple of things to like take note of. Like, this was a fun theme this month, just because we got to explore some areas that you might not have experienced before, and got to try some grape varietals on their own that you might not have gotten to try. And I'd say, like with anything with CruBox, like what we love to do is kind of take that exploration up a notch, and like always keep an open mind when we're drinking wine. Of course, quality is like our foremost focus, but it's just super fun sometimes to try something new. And I think sometimes it feels like you've had it all with wine, but there's always more to explore and to try. So we're always going to try to, I think, find things that are really high quality, interesting, from classic producers, amazing regions, but things sometimes a little outside of the box. That are not being, different for difference sake, but that are like actually made with like purpose and are interesting. So I hope that you guys continue to enjoy some of the selections. And as always, I super appreciate any feedback, as it's always a joy and a pleasure for me and our team at Gordon's to select these wines. And I'll also let you know too, for next month too, we'll be focusing on the wines of Alsace in northern France. So it'll be fun to kind of get a little bit more intense about a specific area. And Alsace is also one of those quintessential regions that's kind of perfect for more of those winter whites, which we'll chat a little bit more about. But it's been so much fun being with you all, and I'll let you all go on to the rest of your evening. I'll be sticking around if you have any questions, you want to chat. And as always, too, always use me as a resource if I can ever help with anything. If you ever have any wine questions or thoughts, feedback you want to share, please go for it. As it's always so much fun getting to share wine with you. So thank you.
But great, thank you, Chelsea.
Thank you very much, and Happy New Year to all of you.
Yes.
Happy New Year.
Holidays to
This
everybody.
was great.
Keep healthy.
Awesome. Thank you.
It's very great. Thank you.
Awesome. Have a great rest of the night, everyone.
Thanks, Chels.
Bye.